Singapore has never hidden what it thinks of itself. It's efficient, wealthy, and disciplined. In fact, the country has built a brand around being the best, and they're loud about it. That attitude doesn't sit well across the region. Neighbors hear pride, but also superiority. Every success story feels like a reminder of its own shortcomings. So Singapore ends up in a strange position, respected for its results, but disliked for how it carries them. I just spent $100,000 investigating why Singapore, one of the richest countries in Asia, is also one of the most hated. And what I discovered will change how you see this tiny island forever. But first, if this video gets 1 million likes, I'm giving away $50,000 to help migrant workers across Southeast Asia. Because what you're about to see is wild. The punctuality flex. Well, Singapore doesn't just keep trains on time, but it makes sure everyone knows that. The country treats punctuality like religion, and anyone late might as well be committing heresy. For locals, that's pride. But for neighbors, it's no less than bragging. Next, let's talk about money. Marina Bay sticks out of the skyline like a permanent middle finger to anyone visiting from Jakarta or Manila, and for the ones shopping in Orchard Road, that actually feels more like a taunt. Look what we can afford. Can you? Neighbors don't exactly find this charming. Malaysia still remembers the split and rolls its eyes every time Singapore acts like the adult in the room. Indonesians quietly wonder how a DOT on the map became more visible internationally than their entire archipelago. And what about Filipinos? Well, if you watch my video about the Philippines, you won't be surprised if you find them cleaning Singapore's houses, running its hospitals, and still get told their culture should stay out of sight. The pattern is pretty obvious. Singapore talks like the smartest kid in class, but it doesn't stop talking. Consequently, pride turns into superiority. The English advantage, they can speak English, which is almost everywhere. Empty in schools, courts, offices, and even in street banter. Singaporeans talk like they're hosting an international conference, while nearby countries still argue about grammar. It sounds impressive, but it also sounds like the Lion City is screaming out loud, "We're global, you're provincial." Globalization has also contributed significantly to their wealth. Singapore's economy is the region's favorite punching bag. On paper, it's an achievement story. The highest GDP per capita in Southeast Asia, a finance hub, a tech hub, and a logistics hub. Basically, if there's a hub, Singapore has already claimed it. However, that bragging comes with side effects. Neighbors don't just see skyscrapers and stock exchanges. They see a country that built its fortune by positioning itself as the middleman for everyone else's hard work. Goods from Indonesia are processed and shipped through Singapore. Investments for the Philippines are routed through Singaporean banks. And when we talk about energy trade, guess which city takes a cut before it reaches anyone's homes? That creates resentment. Singaporeans call it strategy, while others call it parasitism dressed up as genius. Ask around the region and you'll hear the same complaint: we work, they collect. The lifestyle gap. The lifestyle gap adds fuel to the fire. Average salaries in Singapore dwarf those in Manila, Jakarta, or Kuala Lumpur. A Singaporean weekend trip to Bangkok feels like pocket change. But conversely, a weekend trip to Singapore for a neighbor feels like a financial crisis. Migrant workers see both sides. They send money home, but also face a city where locals look at them like disposable tools. Meanwhile, Singapore pats itself on the back for creating opportunities. That spin doesn't sit well with the people actually scrubbing floors and serving tables. So yes, Singapore is wealthy and undoubtedly efficient. However, the way that wealth is flaunted and the way others are reminded of their dependence on it feeds the image of arrogance. Have you got thoughts on this? Feel free to drop them in the comments. Also, hit subscribe if you haven't already. The historical grudges, Singapore's relationship with its neighbors has never been boring. Ask Malaysia. The split in 1965 was almost like Malaysia kicking Singapore out of the house and then watching the kid buy a mansion next door. Pride was bruised, and unfortunately the rivalry never cooled. Every time Singapore talks about its success, Malaysians hear the echo of that old rejection. Then came water. The agreements of 1961 and 1962 gave Singapore the right to draw hundreds of millions of gallons from Johor's rivers at a price that wouldn't even buy you a cup of coffee today. That's 3 cents per 1,000 gallons. Singapore calls it a binding treaty. Malaysians call it daylight robbery with paperwork. The fact that these contracts stretch to 2061 means the argument isn't going anywhere soon. Indonesia added its own brand of hostility during Konfrontasi. From 1963 to 1966, bombs went off in Singapore. The Senate estate bombing killed 2. While the McDonald House bombing in 1965 killed 3 and injured 33 on Orchard Road. Indonesia later tried to frame it as part of the war, but for Singapore it was definitely more an act of terrorism. That wound still lingers whenever the two countries talk about trust. And then there's the Pedra Branca saga. 2 rocks off the coast literally turned into an international court case. In 2008, the International Court of Justice handed Pedra Branca to Singapore and Middle Rocks to Malaysia. But as you might guess, this didn't solve anything. Because in 2017, Malaysia dug up old British files and tried reopening the case. A year later, it quietly dropped the claim. For something literally made of stone, the dispute was surprisingly fragile. The Philippines incident. The Philippines has its own grudge. The 2014 Orchard Road incident still stings. Filipinos wanted to celebrate Independence Day in Singapore's most famous shopping street. The backlash was so intense that the event got shoved into a sports hub. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong even spoke out against the online harassment of organizers behind Philippine Independence Day celebrations in Singapore. All these scraps, the water fights, the bombs, the rock battles, the cultural snubs, paint Singapore as the overachiever, and yet Malaysia still sells the water, Indonesia still does business, and yes, Filipinos still work there. Their friction will never disappear, but neither does the dependence. That's the uneasy balance that defines the region. The control freak nation, where other countries worry about murder, Singapore worries about every piece of gum on the street. Slip it under a bench, and the punishment feels like you've committed tax fraud. Jaywalk once, and everyone despises you. Locals defend it, of course. That's why our streets are clean. That's why our crime is low. And to be honest, they're not wrong. Singapore is safer at 3 a.m. than some capitals are at 3 p.m. However, for neighbors, the strictness feels less like safety and more like control freak behavior turned into national policy. Tourists joke that the entire island is one giant surveillance camera. Malaysians and Indonesians roll their eyes and say, relax, it's just gum. Still, here's the truth. People admire it even as they laugh at it. Singapore may be mocked as robotic, but plenty of countries would trade a little robot energy for working infrastructure. Singaporeans abroad, if you think Singaporeans only act superior at home, ask anyone who's met them abroad. The stereotype isn't subtle. There are loud complaints about food followed by a tone that suggests every other country failed basic quality control.
Singaporeans may find a Bangkok meal too oily or a Manila hotel not as clean as Singapore. Now, to be fair, part of this comes from conditioning. When you grow up where the trains never break down and the streets look polished, every minor flaw overseas feels magnified. What Singaporeans call standards, neighbors often hear as arrogance.
Besides that, Indonesians joke that Singaporeans treat Bali like their backyard, then fly home bragging about how cheap everything was. Filipinos criticize when Singaporeans travel for work and carry the same clipped managerial tone they use with foreign workers at home. Malaysians roll their eyes when Singaporeans cross the causeway and then act as if they're doing Johor a favor. Yet, the truth is way more complicated. Singaporeans abroad also spend freely and follow rules. Moreover, they bring a sense of safety that tourists actually appreciate. Hotels, resorts, and airlines quietly love them. There's another generous tip or polite interaction for every story of a complaint. The UN comfortable truth, additionally, Singapore actually delivers for all the mockery. Governments across the region talk about efficiency while Singapore practices it. You can land at Changi Airport at 2 a.m., clear immigration in minutes, and be in a cab before your friend in Manila even finds a working taxi app. Tourists wander late at night without clutching their bags like life preservers. People make jokes about the fines and the rules. But those same rules mean you can walk home at midnight without worry. The healthcare system also speaks of a quiet victory. While neighbors struggle with overcrowded hospitals, Singapore has built a system that treats patients quickly and attracts foreign medical tourists. The city turned medicine into an export industry while still keeping citizens alive longer than most of Asia. And how can you forget to look at governance? Corruption scandals are rare, and infrastructure delays are hardly a concern. Compare that to Indonesia, where a budget meeting often resembles a shopping spree. Of course, Singapore loves rubbing this all in. The constant self-congratulation is what irritates neighbors. The verdict, so is Singapore arrogant? Absolutely. Is it also incredibly successful? Without question. The problem isn't that Singapore is good at what it does. The problem is that they won't shut up about it. And when you're a tiny island surrounded by massive countries that are still figuring things out, acting like you're better than everyone else doesn't win you friends. It wins you respect, but not love. So if this video hits 1 million likes, I'm giving away $50,000 to help migrant workers in Southeast Asia. Comment below if you've experienced Singapore's attitude firsthand, and subscribe because we're investigating more countries that everyone loves to hate. Singapore is proof that you can be successful and still annoying. And honestly, that might be their greatest achievement. See you in the next one.